right, we're going to move on to some other news because we have a Fox News alert.
It is, of course, day 2 in the urgent search for a missing U.S. airman after an American fighter jet was downed in Iran.
Meanwhile, at least 6 people are hurt in central Israel after Iran fired a round of missiles, leaving behind this damage.
Our own Jonathan Hunt joins us from Tel Aviv with the very latest on both of those stories. Good morning.
Rachel, Kevin, Griff, good morning again to all of you. Iran's military command has just announced on state TV that they shot down the F-15E using a new air defense system. And they say they are confident that that will ultimately give them, the Iranians, control of their airspace. That would, of course, be a monumental shift if it were to happen. There is obviously always some bravado and bluff in Iranian state TV commentary on this. But the search, meantime, goes on for that missing crew member from that F-15E. We have seen on Iranian state TV pictures of some of the wreckage, pictures of the ejector seat believed to have been used by the pilot who was successfully rescued. But the weapons systems officer sitting in the back seat of that F-15 is still missing at this point. The F-15E went down over southwestern Iran, a remote mountainous area, not an easy area in which the U.S. search and rescue teams can operate. They came under small arms fire, some of the helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft involved in that search. 2 of the helicopters, as we understand it, were hit at one point. Crew members injured, but they did make it out to nearby Iraq safely. And as we understand it, those crew members are being treated now. Meantime, we also have learned that an A-10 Warthog with the U.S. Air Force also went down. That went down in the Strait of Hormuz, we are told. The pilot successfully recovered. And finally, back to the action we have seen here in central Israel today. A couple of missile alerts coming in. One, the most recent one, we were live with you at the top of the last hour. That thick black smoke we saw, we thought it might be a direct missile strike. Turns out it was actually the result of one of those cluster munitions, so a smaller strike than a direct missile itself would have been, but it hit a car. The fuel tank of that car exploded, and as you see there, that's what sent that smoke billowing into the air. But a number of people injured in the 2 strikes today. A demonstration once again that Iran retains the capability to hit here in Israel and, of course, to hit its Gulf neighbors too, as we approach President Trump's Monday deadline, remember, for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face the destruction, as President Trump put it, of Iran's energy infrastructure. Back to you guys.
Well,
Thank you,
those
Jonathan.
cluster munitions are terrible as well. Jonathan Hunt, thank you. With that, let's bring in Saturday in America anchor Kayleigh McEnany. Kayleigh, good morning. And let's pick up where Jonathan Hunt left off, which is we have this Monday deadline to reopen the strait or else face massive destruction. But it seems complicated now, particularly if we don't find this second pilot and rescue him.
Yeah, and if I'm the Iranian terrorist regime, I'm reading the news and I'm seeing President Trump on Good Friday was in the Oval Office, his national security team there. And I don't like my odds. That's a president hard at work, a commander-in-chief who knows what he's doing. And when he sets deadlines, remember, he's a businessman and he means them. And he sent out a pretty stark warning to Iran this week. He said, I've bombed the biggest bridge in Iran. There was video of it that was put out. And you better come to the table or there will be consequences. So I wouldn't like my odds if I was on the other side of that negotiating.
But how does the fact that we have a missing airman change that calculation? I mean, you could say we're going to bomb you in 2 days when you've met the deadline, but we may have a guy on the field.
Yeah, and President Trump is always going to prioritize saving that life. We heard the IDF pausing strikes temporarily, and President Trump, that will add into the calculus. So I have no doubt that that is part of the moving pieces here. And just to acknowledge that pilot, like, we are thinking of him, we are praying for him. And, you know, when we say there are casualties of war, it's often lumped together. But there are 13 that we have lost. They have names, they have families. Alex Kleiner, 2 7-month-old twins he left behind, a toddler. I was just reading about Nicole Amer, a mother who had 2 children. She was in Kuwait. They thought she was safe. This is the cost of war. These Americans, they aren't just great Americans. They are the very best Americans, following the footsteps of Jesus Christ and the sacrifices that they make overseas. So we think about that pilot. We pray for his recovery.
Let me add to what Rachel was just telling you about, and that's this idea that it could complicate negotiations. Let me share what the president said. He said, listen, this is not going to change how we do things. He expressed frustration about some of the coverage, what is plainly an intense and sensitive rescue operation. Asked if today's events will affect any negotiations with Iran. The president said it would not. No, not at all. No, it's war. We are in war. And yet, one would imagine that they better be careful on their side of this thing, because let's face it, Kayleigh, if they capture this person and they parade this person, I would not want to be in the regime.
No, I wouldn't want to be either. And I think when we view President Trump's statements, having worked for him, having seen how he operates, he is always communicating to someone. And sometimes that's the American people. That is, of course, his priority.
Good point.
But other times it is a communication to the enemy. And so when we view his communications, you know, people were saying, oh, he's going to come out and announce a ground operation when he did that primetime, address. I said, there's no chance he would ever do that. He's not going to broadcast his strategy. And when he says, no, this won't change our operation, he's not going to say to Iran, yes, this is changing things, we're backing down. He's doing the internal calculus behind the scenes, and what he broadcasts is a specific message for a specific person.
One of the things that we noticed about President Trump, or one of the things we've noticed about his economy, he brought back in 2016, we had a terrible economy coming out of Barack Obama, and he gave us the most amazing economy in all of our lifetimes. 50-year high in everything. Every class of people were up. Home ownership was up. Everything was booming. Then COVID happened, and then we had Joe Biden. President Trump, again, against a lot of people saying it wasn't going to work, introduced tariffs. He's brought back a lot of manufacturing. He improved the gas and oil situation. And we saw gas prices lower. We saw jobs come up. And I think when we've been talking about it all morning, we were on the verge in April, if not for the war, to see an absolute boom in this economy. Now, of course, tempered a little bit because of the war, but not as much as people thought. And we're seeing that in some of the numbers this week, that it's not the boom we thought, but it's also not the bust you would expect from a war that involves so much oil. Here is something here from Gallup poll. They asked Americans if they're worried about key issues. They said the economy worry is down by 9 points. Crime and violence worries have dropped by 8 points. Illegal immigration, no surprise. He's closed the borders. He's solved that problem. It's off the table, down by 6 points. What do you make of the economy, the sentiment of America during this war, but also coming into the midterms, not too far away?
Yeah, there was a fantastic jobs report. I took great joy in watching CNN last night. Have to admit that the jobs report exceeded expectations. The gas prices, are they high? Yes, they are. Are they Biden high? $5 per gallon? No. And what did we get from $5 a gallon gas prices under Biden? Absolutely nothing. What might we get from this temporary blip? We might get a non-nuclear Iran, the biggest threat on the globe, really eradicated. And the gas prices, by the way, coming down. We could be in a very different position 2 months from now. I agree with the president. He can change that. But I think that poll is interesting that you guys pull up from Gallup. I think there's this sense of you have a president who's constantly doing things. If you think back to midweek, what did he do all in one day? He addressed the nation on Iran. You saw Artemis II take off, a historic moment for America. And by the way, he did the job of Congress in making sure that DHS got funded.
That's right.
Something he should not have had to do, but he did it himself single-handedly by making sure those civilian employees that you and I talked about this week got paid. I think there's a sense he's doing things. Not to put too rosy of a picture on it, though, midterms will be hard for Republicans. Just it's historically difficult to win when you're in power. But I would like my odds more with this president than prior presidents.
Well, and, let's not forget.
Then a little voter security will go a long way.
True.
Just saying.
You talk about President Trump and stuff. Remember, the previous president would call lids at 9 in the morning. Which means the president's not going to do anything for the rest of the day, and it's not even noon. I thought it was interesting. James Freeman, columnist in Wall Street Journal, talked about kind of maybe what you're talking about, saying, is there something about a Trump White House that makes us exhale? Inside, he says Mr. Trump's adversaries in politics and the press have spent a decade making the case that he is a uniquely dangerous threat to the country, yet the Gallup data that we just showed suggests that Americans view his time in office as a time when threats recede.
Al-Baghdadi, gone on his watch. Soleimani, gone on his watch. Two dictators toppled on his watch. Look, domestically, the southern border, we don't even think about it. It barely rates as an important issue anymore because he's stopped that threat, and crime in our cities he's taken on. So when I go to sleep at night, do I feel better with the president who has tangible action? Certainly much better than the president who just said don't and called lids in the morning oftentimes. And you got the sense of a lethargic presidency. I'm, of course,
and let's not forget what he's done in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, listen, I have a lot of questions about the war, and I think there's a lot of Americans that are worried. It's not, let's not pretend and sugarcoat this like that we're somehow out of the woods or anything like that. We have a soldier on the ground. Things could escalate. We hope that he finds an off-ramp here soon and we can get back to normal. But what he's done in the Western Hemisphere cannot be underestimated. That is the most important region for all of us. These are our neighbors. And he's single-handedly, one by one, rooting out communism, dictators, and the threats of many of these regimes that they had embedded themselves, the Chinese, the Iranians, into Latin America. And so that cannot be underestimated. We talked earlier on the couch, Kayleigh, one of the problems is you start solving some of these problems, the border, the Western Hemisphere, the Chinese in our backyard. It's like people stop talking about it, and now it can be also an election problem coming into the midterms because you solve some of those problems.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.